So this is the lecture for Module 3 on the second half of Catherine Keller's book, Cloud of the Impossible. Keller has been poetically unfolding what I hope you would agree is a refreshingly open theological orientation. She's looking at an array of important planetary topics in the second half of this book, including the post-structuralist dissolution or deconstruction of the idea of substance. She's looked at the deconstruction of rigid gender binaries, thinking with the Kant of queer theory, as she is known, Judith Butler. Keller's looked at the history of the Christian Crusades and their relation to the rise of colonial modernity and out of that global capitalism. She's attempted a retrieval of Gaia as a potentially more adequate name for God than Father or King. And she unfolds from the implications of all of these topics, possible sources of hope for our imperiled planet. But she also traverses these topics with radical epistemological uncertainty, with every step of the way also reiterating our ontological inseparability from one another, from the ecologies of this planet, and perhaps from the divine ground within which all of us, human and non, subsist. So you'll notice how at various points Keller has some words for perhaps overconfident secularists. Secularists may protest that turning to a theological mode of discourse like Keller's in the face of our species' present social, political, and ecological problems is only to regress into the very source of our problems. The secularist might ask, why rehash the religious myths of the past if we modern, rational people now have the precision instruments of scientific knowledge, powerful machine technologies, and capitalist markets to guide us into a better future? So in response, with help from Keller, I would say that, first of all, myth is not a childish embellishment or projection upon reality derived from socio-political relations. It's rather, myth is or can be understood to be the divine ground of our individual and collective lives. And, we can think here in a kind of Jungian depth psychological way by remembering that we don't grow out of myth, right? We, at best, grow out of one myth and into another, more mature, relational, open form of myth or story or narrative that guides our sense of the purpose of life. Without myth, psyche and polis, right, our souls and the social, the communities that we engage in would have no way of attuning to cosmos, right? And with no attunement to the cosmos, Thomas Berry would remind us that we will find no functional relationship with the ecosystems of the planet, right? Because as Berry said, ecology is just functional cosmology. Modernity's rituals of certain knowledge, techno-capitalist extraction, and uprooted progress are themselves zealously drenched in their own kind of mythic mana, as we've seen with Keller, and as we'll see more in the readings for later modules, Donna Haraway, and the next module, Bruno Latour later on. We'll see how, as Latour put it, we have never been modern if modern means without myth, without any inheritance from this, at least in modern Europe, this biblical history, right? So so much of the psychic charge that's driving the industrial growth mentality and the industrial narratives of progress stems from a closed and decidedly non-apophatic reading of the biblical tradition. And, Keller is trying to return to and reread this tradition rather than just seeding the Bible and the lineage, the soil out of which modern European and North American civilization has grown. She wants to reread it to challenge the interpretations of the religious rite. So second of all, then, in response to the sort of secularist critique of what Keller's up to, what her project is in this book, her theopoetics are not the divine fiats of a Pope Urban II, right? Nor are they the violent repressions of evangelical Christian capitalists. She talks God otherwise, right? She's a process theologian who learned her God talk from Whitehead and from some of his interpreters and inheritors in the second half of the 20th century, like David Ray Griffin and John Cobb Jr., both of whom were her teachers. Griffin, incidentally, just passed away in November of 2022, and John Cobb Jr., though, still going strong. I think he's 96 now. But for Keller, inheriting this tradition of process theology, God is, as Whitehead put it, the poet of the world, right? A fellow sufferer who understands, seeking with tender care that nothing be lost. Whitehead's God lures the universe from the shipwreck of history toward what we could call Shekinah, this Hebrew word that comes out of the Kabbalist tradition. Keller dwells on it more than once, and it means something like divine dwelling. And it has a feminine connotation as well, Shekinah. From shipwreck toward Shekinah is one way of rendering how Whitehead's God participates in the world as a fellow sufferer, trying to call us toward more beautiful possibilities. Very different from the idea of a divine dictator commanding from on high what must happen. Whitehead's God doesn't have control over creatures, and in fact is itself a creature of creativity, right? So it's a very different theology, this process theology that Keller is poetically rendering for us. So though in her book, Cloud of the Impossible, though she draws heavily on ancestral Christian sources like Nicholas of Cusa and Giordano Bruno, she explicates from them not the militant ghosts of pre-modern omnipotence, as she puts it, but instead of relational pluralism, where God is, as Cusa had it, the supreme complication, right? The dark cloud wherein each is inseparably implicated in all. God is non-aliud, again in Cusa's terms, or non-other, whose name is infinite and so ineffable, and for this very reason enfolding infinitely many names. In Cusa's terms, I quote from his book De Docta Ignorantia, on learned ignorance, quote, "All the names are unfoldings of the enfolding one ineffable name, and as this proper name is infinite, so it enfolds an infinite number of such names of particular perfections. Although there could be many such unfoldings, they are never so many or so great that there could not be more." End quote. God has been given many names: Yahweh, Christ, man, machine, capital. Each is more or less imperfectly conveying the divine mystery. Keller performs her pluralism theologically, not because she seeks to violently settle a diverse society on a new peace-instilling divine name, but because our modern scientific and political perspectives are, in her words, inexplicable, apart from medieval theological presumptions of a creation good and open to reason. Right? In other words, as Whitehead argues at length in his book Science and the Modern World, modern European science emerges in the context of medieval scholastic theology, which included this idea, this faith, ultimately, in the rationality of the universe, and that the human mind was created so as to be able to decode the rationality of that universe, right? This is a rather unique set of religious conditions that Whitehead and Keller following Whitehead argue was essential for this form of natural science to take shape and to flourish, right? So the inheritors of European Christendom can think God otherwise, as Keller does, but at least if we take Keller's argument seriously, but cannot think without God. So then in chapter 5, The Fold in Process, Keller folds together, but not without remainder, the work of Whitehead with the French post-structuralist Gilles Deleuze. Each, in their own ways, creatively unsaid the metaphysics of substance and instead celebrated the differential connectivity of the world. Deleuze, like Whitehead, was influenced by William James's pluralistic and pragmatic orientation to philosophy. Keller puts it this way: in the Deleuzian work, quote, concepts themselves are multiplied and mobilized. They do not reflect, mirror, or subserve the real. Rather, Deleuzian concepts participate in its becoming. They do not cut the world into abstractions. They ply the world. They apply themselves to its practices. End quote. So in other words, rather than construing philosophy as a search for the true concepts that would accurately represent or mirror the nature of mind-independent reality, Deleuze engaged philosophy as the creation of new concepts capable of transforming reality, irrespective of any imagined boundaries supposedly separating mental from physical or spiritual from material. Novel concepts resonate in the world, shaking up its settled order, or old concepts repeat endlessly, shoring up settled natural and social habits. So concepts are not mere mirrors, reflectively uninvolved in the workings of the world. Deleuze wants us to come to see their meaning and value are derived from what they do, right? From what these concepts make it possible to do. Keller skillfully unpacks the resonances and dissonances between Deleuze's Spinozist pantheism and Whitehead's process-relational panentheism. She wonders if the former's insistence on pure immanence is really the best way to overcome the separative transcendence that is so characteristic of traditional theology. Whitehead's theology rejects the tendency so prevalent in the ontotheological traditions, for example, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to pay metaphysical compliments to God. For example, that God is all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful, and so on. Whitehead's process-relational God, as we've seen, is not the sovereign exception to, but the prime exemplification of the creative advance of nature. This is why Whitehead describes his God as a creature of creativity. God as a creature. It would be hard to imagine, a more heretical statement from the point of view of an Orthodox Christian, Jewish, or Islamic theologian, so used to imagining God as omnipotent. but nonetheless, Whitehead is unwilling to jettison the divine function entirely. He wants to reimagine this all-powerful God, but keep God nonetheless. Deleuze, on the other hand, celebrates the death of God with a more Nietzschean zeal. So then in chapter 6, Unfolded Out of the Folds, Keller reads the poet Walt Whitman as the queer father of an ecological humanity, as she puts it. Whitman's fragmentary and spontaneous style could be said to have arisen out of the cultural context of antebellum America at this point, prior to the Civil War, when hope in the democratic experiment was still running high. But Whitman himself would live through the war. He served as a nurse during the war, in fact, and this no doubt made him intimately familiar with the anatomy of death. But this did not dampen his hope. It did not dampen the carnal, ecosexual celebration that vibrates off so many pages of his poetry. Keller interprets the sexual politics of the time, of Whitman's time, showing how ahead of his time he was, and how untimely was his confident sense of identity. She highlights not only his homoeroticism, his probable bisexuality, but also his insistence upon the greatness of women. Whitman writes, quote, "I say there is nothing greater than the mother of men." Quote, "Unfolded out of the folds of the woman, man comes unfolded, and is always to come unfolded." End quote. So reading Whitman in historical context, at which, as Keller says, was an epoch when maternity was the given of women's lives, Keller does not feel that Whitman is reducing womanhood to motherhood, but rather giving voice to the egalitarian spirit running through so much of his work. As he says, I quote, "I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man, and I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man." In Betsy Erkilla's words, Whitman sought to, quote, "revive the mother not as a biological function, but as a creative and intellectual force." Keller reads Whitman also through Deleuze, whose nomadic, rhizomatic pluralism was inspired by Whitman's multiversal verse. Deleuze draws from Whitman a view of selfhood not as an enclosed monad, but as composed out of the world itself, and of nature not as a totality, but as an assembly, right? Not a form, a closed, fixed form, but a process of relating. Whitman believes even a leaf of grass to be the journey work of the stars, and sees threads connecting the nebular nurseries of the heavens to the wombs and father stuff of more earthly births. It would not be unfitting to call Walt an eco or cosmosexual. And Keller finds in him also an apophatic affirmation of panentheistic mystery. As Whitman says, I quote, "I hear and behold God in every object, yet understand God not in the least." Then in chapter 7, Keller turns to, again, the Kant of queer theory, Judith Butler. Keller differentiates the 20th century social constructionist Butler, Butler 1, as Keller has it, who brilliantly deconstructed falsely naturalized gender norms using the tools of post-structuralism, from the 21st century social ontologist Butler, or Butler 2, who, after exposure to Whitehead, overcame some of her earlier ethical anthropocentrism by articulating a relational ontology that queered reality itself. Keller writes, I quote, "Whitehead, attending to the exclusions wrought by closed systems, hearkens to the non-human universe. alive and participant in all our finite human decisions. As Whitehead had it, quote, "We have no right to deface the value experience, which is the very essence of the universe," as Whitehead put it in Modes of Thought. Back to Keller, an attention to the not yet known of the entire creaturely plenum, nurtured by his mathematical involvement in the natural sciences and his love of the romantic poets of his region, now carries the force of ancestral prophecy. The ethical anthropocentrism of Butler's philosophy, even after the end of the last millennium, counts in this one way as the more traditional. End quote. Still, Keller celebrates Butler's late turn, Butler II, her turn to the queerness of a relational ontology. Keller criticizes post-structuralism's prior tendency to over-focus on the way we are constructed by language, culture, and society while downplaying or ignoring our no less lively relations to non-humans. Post-structuralist approaches, and you could read postmodernist approaches here more generally, follow the relations and ruptures of linguistic signs with other signs in systems of signification with great precision and insight. Such an approach can and has called out oppressive social structures that shape culture by disguising it as nature, thus opening pathways toward more ethical human relations. But Keller invites us to ask, what about our relations to such non-human diversities as fireflies, microchips, polar bears, coronaviruses, plate tectonics, and starlight? In her reflections on Whitehead's relational ontology, Butler admits to having to distance herself from her own early formulations of the sex-gender distinction, quote, in which nature was presumed to be facticity or mute materiality, and gender the work of language, culture, and social norms, end quote. This nature-society binary is just a subtler form of Cartesian dualism, ultimately, that Whitehead's process relational queering of ontology attempts to undo. Our biological bodies are not just raw material awaiting cultural inscriptions, as though our minds were masters of their matter. On Whitehead's reading, our bodies are already societies of cells, each cell a society of organic molecules, and so on, all the way down. I am thus, in my physiology, as well as my psychological identity, constituted in and by a sociality that precedes me and that I do not fully author. In the next module, we'll see how the Whiteheadian feminist philosopher Donna Haraway makes a similar point in her essay on situated knowledges. In addition to her encounter with Whitehead, Butler was motivated to undertake her ontological insurrection by way of a meditation on loss, precarity, and mourning. Mourning reveals to us what was always already the case before the loss of a loved one, namely that ourselves, by themselves, are incomplete due to their constitutive relationality. I quote Butler, quote, "It is not as if an I exists independently over here and then simply loses a you over there, especially if the attachment to you is part of what composes who I am. Who am I without you? When we lose some of these ties by which we are constituted, we do not know who we are or what to do." That's quoted from Butler's book, Precarious Life. So just as with the entangled intra-actions of physical quanta, human souls are stitched together from the inside out by threads of precarious and promiscuous influence. Let's face it, writes Butler, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. Keller links Butler's still human-focused ethics of relationality to Whitehead's process relational ontology. Quote, loss belongs to the ecology of becoming, as all our relations are composed of prehensions, of perishing others as they pass into us. By dying into one another, in other words, we create one another. And this goes deep into, Whitehead's process relational ontology, where every moment of our existence is a creature arising out of the creative plenum and arising out of a historical root, a past, realizing itself as a unique individual and then perishing into the future to be inherited by subsequent actual occasions, as Whitehead would call them. And so whether we're thinking at the level of the human generations of individuals being born, living, and dying, or we're thinking at the level of electromagnetic radiation, of pulses of energy, rhythmically reproducing themselves across galaxies, we're dealing with the process that Whitehead would describe in terms of occasions of experience arising and dying into one another, thereby creating one another. So this process of decomposition and recomposition is occurring at every scale of nature, human and non, and it reiterates endlessly to the crack of doom, as Whitehead puts it. This marks for Whitehead the primary miracle of creation, whereby the dry bones of the past are clothed again in the flesh of renewed purpose and a zest for life. It is the miracle whereby actual occasions perpetually perish and yet live forevermore, as they are resurrected again in the present. Butler, speaking directly to Whiteheadians eager to overcome anthropocentrism, warns of the risks of overlooking the profound singularity of loss. And this is important for Whiteheadians to hear, because this ontology of creative becoming, though it does emphasize the uniqueness of each creature, is attuned to singularity, nonetheless, with its open-ended optimism about ongoing process, may not be as singularly attuned in the way that Butler is asking for here. And Keller indeed amplifies Butler's concerns. I quote her, "Celebrations of the cycles of life and death may not support the human ethic that suffers individual losses and honors grief. The human difference needs protecting from reductive indifference." End quote. So we ought to stay as close as possible to such concerns as we move through the material of this course, since so much of it calls us to attend radically to that which is not human. My hope is that it is precisely through recovering a sense of ethical relation with non-humans that our true humanness will become most apparent. Perhaps it is the very search for some supernatural identity apart from the planet of our birth that has so degraded our humanity. Moving on then to chapter 8, Crusade, Capital, and Cosmopolis. Keller traces the way that the medieval Christian West overcame its internal divisions, or strived to overcome them, in order to discover a unifying sense of identity through centuries of crusading against Islam. Western self-identity is thus constitutively Islamophobic. I quote Keller, "Let those who have been fighting..." Oh, sorry, this is actually Pope Urban II. I quote, "Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians." All right, so this was Pope Urban II's rallying cry in 1095 on the eve of the First Crusade to push back the Turks and retake the Holy Land. Several centuries of crusading later, after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire in 1453, Nicholas of Cusa, by then a respected Catholic cardinal, called for a conference of faiths instead of yet another religious war. In place of forced conversion to Christianity or to Islam, Kusa imagined a conversation among representatives of many faiths who, with help from the divine Logos, might come to agree that though there are many religious or cultural rites the world over, rites or rituals, among them Christianity and Islam, there is only one infinite and thus, as we've seen, ineffable God. Kusa articulates what could be Christendom's earliest doctrine of religious inclusivism. To the Logos, he says, quote, "Rivalry among faiths exists for the sake of you, whom alone they revere in everything that all seem to worship." While Kusa's mystical inclusivism may fall short of the sort of radically relational pluralism that we would want to seek in this course, in its time and place, at the sunrise of modernity, it too was radical. Perhaps even today, the two biggest religions, Christianity and Islam, still have much to learn from an inclusivist theology like Kusa's, since both remain, for the most part, dead set on exclusivist interpretations of the truth of their own doctrines. Keller's hope is that a relational pluralism might help exclusivists begin to feel what they share with other faiths, namely a love of God, what Kusa has allowed us to name the infinite complication, which enfolds all the world's religious expressions. Keller goes on in this chapter to enter into dialogue with Enrique Dussel's thesis on the origins of modernity, not in northern Germany with Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation, as Hegel had it, but rather in the Spanish conquest of the Americas. From Dussel's perspective, Descartes' ego cogito was preceded and sustained by an ego conquero, right? The I think sustained by an I conquer. Quote, Dussel, "If the ego cogito doubts the world around him, the ego conquero doubts the very humanity of conquered others." In our hypermodern age, the crusader complex has taken the form of global capitalism, in which oil and therefore Islam figures prominently. Keller quotes the political analyst Thomas Frank, who in his book One Market Under God argued that sometime in the mid-1990s, people came to believe that, quote, "there is something natural, something divine, something inherently democratic about markets." This is quite a strange litany of adjectives, I think you'll agree. The global capitalist market is said to be entirely natural, a consequence of biological evolution, right? The struggle for existence and competition among organisms. And yet at the same time, it is also described as divine, as though it represented the only source of human salvation. And also it is described as democratic. Keller admits that capitalism's, as she puts it, flexible interactivity captures something of the ontological process of entanglement. And she also accepts that attempted solutions to our planetary problems by way of some kind of top-down state communist imposition are doomed to failure. And yet, contemporary neoliberal capitalism does not advertise the pluriverse's participatory matrix of each in each. Rather, it asserts an ontology of isolable individuals, counted ego by ego, pushing a new ruse of separability that nonetheless stays, quote-unquote, connected. From Keller's process theological perspective, any effective resistance to the God of the global capitalist market must be a religious form of resistance. She introduces the political theology of Carl Schmitt, who argued that all supposedly modern political theories of the state are really just secularized theological concepts, Schmidt's approach led him to a theory of the state wherein political order is achieved through the exceptional might of an all-powerful sovereign. Keller asks instead if we, quote, can have some transmodern rendition of political theology that does not take its cues from the militant ghosts of this pre-modern omnipotence. And she offers Whitehead's panentheism as a truly democratic alternative to Schmidt's totalitarian theism, right? Because for Whitehead, God is not the supreme exception, but the supreme example, the fellow sufferer who understands. Not the might of the sovereign, but the rights of divinely entangled individuals would rule in a panentheistic social ontology. We'll return to Carl Schmitt in the final module when I share a paper of mine engaging with the Whiteheadian process liberal, Dan Dombrowski, bringing Dombrowski to bear on Dombrowski's form of process liberalism to bear on and in response to Carl Schmitt's political theology. So that's module 10. Keller gives the last word in chapter 8 to the 12th century Iberian Muslim philosopher Ibn Arabi. I quote Arabi: God is the root of every diversity in beliefs in the cosmos. The paths to God are thus as numerous as the breaths of the creatures. That from Ibn Arabi. Then in chapter 9, Broken Touch, the Ecology of the Impossible, Keller elucidates the hidden meaning of the Pergamon altar, depicting a groaning Gaia reaching out for one of her stricken children beneath a victorious Athena. She reads the scene as a metaphor for the origins of the polis, or perhaps even civilization as such. I quote Keller, "It would seem that we have to do here with an ancient complex relation to the earth home, which is sacrificed on the altar of civilization, driven into the civilizational unconscious. Might we recognize here," Keller asks, "a Gaia complex? It lends a face to the more ancient and diffuse fear of the non-human universe, from which the human is inseparable. Call it ecophobia." Keller then turns to the famous climate scientist, James Lovelock, to exemplify the way a new story of Gaia is being brought forth in our ecologically imperiled age. Lovelock, who passed away recently, had grown towards the end of his life increasingly skeptical of humanity's chances of averting the worst of climate change and the broader ecological catastrophe. The time to wake up and take responsibility for the destabilizing effects of human industry on the planet has passed. "I fear," Lovelock wrote, that we still dream on, and rather than waking, we weave the sound of the alarm clock into our dreams." That from Lovelock's book, The Vanishing Face of Gaia. What is still possible now that civilization has gone so far past the tipping point of planetary catastrophe? Humanity stands face to face with Gaia and, so far, remains dumbstruck. An entire ignorance industry has sprung up to keep us that way. I quote Keller, "The entanglement of the human in the crowding non-humanity of the species and elements of the earth endlessly overwhelms speech with both wonder and horror." End quote. Might a renewed attempt at ego-theology help shepherd our species through the coming evolutionary bottleneck? Might we Earthlings, our collectivity delicately composed by our shared planetary fate? Might we find in the face of Gaia a source of numinous meaning powerful enough to heal the ecophobic repression at the root of our civilization? Keller wonders aloud, I quote, "How on earth is the earth itself, Gaia, inclusive of all of us, a less apt God name than the name of a mere bit of the earth, like a father or a king?" She quotes the Protestant theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who declares that, quote, "Gaia must become the universal space for the world religions." In other words, from Moltmann's point of view, all the world religions must become earth religions, because earth is the context of all human religions. In a later module, when we read Bruno Latour, we'll see another attempt to make good on the political potential of a new Gaian theology. In chapter 10, then, finally, in Questionable Love, Keller questions her own tradition, examining some New Testament texts and early Christian theologians to see what is living and what should be laid to rest. While she finds plenty to criticize in Paul and Augustine, she's unwilling to throw the baby out with the baptismal water. Despite its tendency to push these texts and their contexts out of hearing, Keller argues that much of what secular humanism deems to be ethical progress stems, in fact, from biblical sources. Rather than denying modernity's entanglement with Christianity, with this biblical history, and thus ceding the Bible to the religious right, Keller engages in what she calls a Christographic exercise, to reread the Gospels and Paul's letters otherwise. In place of the exceptional incarnation of Jesus Christ as King, she invites us to consider the intercarnation of Christic democracy, wherein God is refigured as the spirit of loving relation itself. I quote Keller, "A relation and so a God which does not happen apart from our participation." Not only our participation in word, but in deed, and indeed in flesh. So that's it for Keller's Cloud of the Impossible. From here, we turn to Module 4 to Donna Haraway, who is not unaware of the complex ambiguous inheritance of these biblical traditions, but who is certainly more secular than Keller in her inheritance of these traditions. So we'll read Staying with the Trouble, as well as an essay by her, which I mentioned earlier in this lecture, on situating knowledge. So I will see you in the discussion forum for Module 3.